Greetings, podcast powerhouses. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, a podcast tackling our collective obsession with the latest releases from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As you know, I've opened every single episode of the Marvelous TV Club podcast with one of those alliterations. Audio Avengers, Legendary Listeners, Waveform Warriors, that sort of a thing. And the reason is simple. It's a callback to the voice of Stan Lee, who loved alliteration in everything from notes to readers to names of characters, right? Bruce Banner, Reed Richards, Peter Parker, Sue Storm, you get the idea. After all, of course, I wanted to connect our pod with the vibe of Stan Lee. He created the Marvel Universe, right? At least that's what the pages of Marvel have suggested since I started reading comics in the 80s, and the movies do the same. I mean, hell, Marvel just released an epic teaser compilation of the next 3 years of movies, narrated with the voice of Stan Lee, even though he passed away in 2018. Stan Lee is synonymous with Marvel and its most iconic characters like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four because he created them, right? Well, not so fast. Recently, my PonderVision co-host, Jesse Taylor, turned me on to a richly researched, there I go again with alliterations, a thoroughly researched new biography of Stan Lee titled True Believer by author Abraham Riesman. The book challenges the myth of Stan Lee as the primary the main creator of the Marvel Universe, so today we are going to interrogate this assumption. Joining me to do just that, from his legal fortress in an undisclosed and heavily fortified location, is the one and only Jesse Taylor. Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Marc, how are you doing today?
Good, man, but we are not alone today, are we, Jesse?
We are not. We have Abraham Riesman with us, a Providence-based journalist and the author of, as you mentioned, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. Abe's work has appeared in New York Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, The Boston Globe, The New Republic, and Vice, among others. Abe is also currently working on Ringmaster, a biography of World Wrestling Entertainment CEO Vince McMahon. And if his Twitter is any indication, he just got back from a coyote-laden road trip. Do I have that right?
Yes, you've done your research. My spouse and I were driving, and we both saw a coyote by the side of the highway. And for me, this was something I noticed, and for my spouse, it was a kind of a religious experience. She then went on and on about how her life was just different now. Now she was somebody who'd seen a coyote, and my favorite thing she said was, "Now I have something to tell people when they ask what I've been doing all day, like what I've been up to." Sorry, that was it. Anyway, blah blah blah. Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, we are definitely happy to have you on.
Based on things like merchandise data, number of comics titles, all that, Spider-Man is probably Marvel's most popular character of all time, and the Fantastic Four might be the most iconic superhero team of all time. At a minimum, Fantastic Four #1 is usually considered the beginning of the modern Marvel era. If you were to ask the question, who created Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, most people, even hardcore fans like me, would probably answer something like, well, Stan Lee wrote a comic script and his artists brought it to life. And the general lack of record keeping makes it tough to say for sure what actually happened. Well, I learned that from the book True Believer, anyway. The book pokes some pretty big holes in the likelihood of this pat narrative, Abraham, and that's what I want to discuss as our first topic. The myth versus what we know of the reality of who created Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. So to explore this idea, one place we could start is with the process of how these comics came to life. So Abraham, what can you tell us about the way Stan Lee worked with artists like Steve Ditko on Spider-Man and Jack Kirby on the Fantastic Four in the early to mid-60s when these stories were birthed into the world?
Sure. So, you just referred to them as artists, and that's conventionally how they have been credited. But really, when they were working with Stan, at least, these were writer artists. These were people who were doing both of those jobs. Because, as you say, the popular conception may be that, a comic by Stan and, let's say, Jack Kirby came from a script written by Stan and then art drawn based on that script, drawn by Jack. It wasn't that simple. There was this kind of slightly amorphous, unorthodox, and sadly kind of convoluted process that was used to make these comics. It's called the Marvel method. It's sort of subsequently what it was dubbed. At the time, it was just this triage measure that didn't have any particular fanfare when it debuted or anything. It's actually unclear when Stan started implementing the Marvel method, in that sometimes in interviews going all the way back to the 40s and 50s, you have people saying, oh, well, I didn't have a script. We did this weird little thing. And it really crystallized in the late 50s and 60s. So what was it? Marvel method is this process where there's some kind of discussion initially between Stan and one of the writer artists. And that conversation, the nature of it is oft debated, whether it was more of a one-way conversation or a dialogue. But after that, what would happen is in that discussion, there would be some small germ of what was going to exist. At best, maybe there would be like a rough outline of how it would go. But after that, the writer artist would then go home. They were all freelancers.
Right.
They would go home and put together, they would write the comic, just not with text. Well, maybe text in the marginalia, but basically they would write through pictures the entire story. It would become concrete. And very often, by Stan's own admission, some of these, initial conversations, the prompt could be as vague as him saying, let's bring back Dr. Doom for this issue. And there were times when Stan even admitted, he stopped doing this later in life, but earlier on, he would say, sometimes, Jack will tell me what we're going to do. Now, according to Jack, it wasn't sometimes I'll tell him what to do. It was always I tell him what to do. Jack always contended that, and this is straying a little bit from the Marvel method and into the larger creative questions, sure, but they're really intimately tied. Jack always maintained that he was the progenitor of the Marvel universe, that the characters that we think of as the iconic Marvel characters all came from ideas that he came up with. And Jack did have decades of experience in creating characters and been very successful at it. He'd come up with along with Joe Simon, he'd come up with Captain America decades prior. But the question is, once you start going from that conversation to the creation of that drawn comic, are you the primary writer at that point? Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but you would then, I'm sorry, you jump into the Marvel method, and the trouble is it has its tendrils going out to all the other topics. But
that's part of the challenge, right? Is it's this very amorphous process, and
wait. I do want to finish just because your listeners might get confused. They're probably already confused from all of my rambling. But basically, the writer artist would go home, do the pages, bring them back to Stan, and then Stan would add in. Well, there would be revisions, and then Stan would add in the dialogue and captions. And then, go to the letterer, and then it was a simplified version, but that was basically the order of operations. And it's not, therefore, as simple as Stan was the writer. Stan wasn't doing any writing in that process, any substantial writing, until he's putting in the dialogue and the narration. Even if he's, helping come up with the ideas in the initial part, that's kind of the role of an editor, and he was a great editor. But, when it comes to the actual writing of the comic, the bulk of that was usually on the writer artist. That said, Stan's contributions in that process were immeasurably important. I mean, as you say, you're talking about the alliteration, the quality of that dialogue and narration was something that people really responded to. It was a huge factor, as was the letters pages, the back matter, the bullpen bulletins and previews of the new issues of the new Marvel comics that were coming out. That was all Stan using the written word and really engaging people. But the comics themselves, the creation process was a little complicated, and you're starting to, I hope, get the idea of all the threads that you start to pull, and then all of a sudden things get very murky very quickly.
And to the extent how prevalent was the Marvel method outside of Stan Lee at Marvel?
Oh, virtually non-existent. I mean, the Marvel method is primarily associated with Stan and with, to a certain extent, other people in the Marvel shop at that point and later. But Marvel method, it's not that it's never used, but it's not nearly as prevalent as full script, which is what you call the other version of the the initial vision you might have of how a comic gets created is called full script. And to my knowledge, nobody else was doing it as of then. It was at least not in that particular form.
Okay. Because there was an interesting anecdote in the book that you had, I think it was Neil Adams, who was excited about coming to Marvel because of the Marvel method. And I guess he thought the editorial freedom that it provided to artists.
Yeah. Well, Neil Adams said that, as did John Romita Sr. when I spoke to him. John Romita Sr. being one of the great, writer artists that he worked with. Romita is from sort of the second generation of big Marvel artists. And unlike the first generation, which consists mostly of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, Romita was actually very happy with the Marvel method. Ditko and Kirby, saw its necessity perhaps, but really, especially later in life, had no love for the way it had obscured their contributions. But Romita emphasized something that he's not alone in feeling. A lot of other writer artists would say this. The Marvel method allowed them to take the lead. They could draw a comic based on what made sense for them to draw or what they wanted to draw, et cetera. However they wanted to do a layout, all of that stuff, they had the opportunity to be the first mover on. And obviously, they could get overruled or whatever, but it was, as what Romita said to me was, comics becomes a visual medium, which is a funny thing to say, because obviously comics is like a fundamentally visual medium, but that hyperbole tells you how freeing it was for him. It felt like, this is a primarily visual story. And since I'm the visuals person, I get to sort of decide how that goes to a certain extent. So it's a trade-off, especially when you then credit people the way Stan often credited his writer artists as just like illustrated by or drawn by or, pencils by, whatever, art by. And, because that wasn't all they were doing. It's and that's, again, not even getting into the question of who created the characters, but just the day-to-day grind of creating these comics was kind of ambiguous.
I certainly love the idea of writer-artist as the way to think of Kirby and Ditko and the people who are part of this Marvel method, whether they loved it or not, to Jesse's point about Neil Adams and stuff. So obviously in the book, you have this incredibly detailed description of the complicated stories that are out there, for example, about Spider-Man specifically. That one has several.
Oh yeah, that would bore your listeners for me to get into all the details. But yeah,
I mean, I disagree. They should read the book to get that, because it's actually pretty awesome. But what I will, at a cocktail party, for example, how would Stan Lee tend to describe the creation of these characters versus what, say, Ditko and Kirby would tend to say? Like,
well, it would depend on when you caught him. I mean, the funny thing about Spider-Man is, Stan, when he began anecdotes about creating Spider-Man, had this habit of saying, I've told this story so often that it might even be true, which is, a clever, cheeky thing to say. But then, of course, he would just tell the story and people would ignore the first part and just record it as gospel. But that was the prelude. But what the anecdote would consist of often changed. He sometimes said he was inspired by, the beginning of the process was he was trying to come up with a superhero and saw a fly on the wall and then decided he wanted to have an insect. Fly didn't sound good. Mosquito didn't sound good, but spider, oh, that sounds good. And I didn't, a bug. Sometimes he would say it began because he wanted to create a teenage superhero, which was something that hadn't been done really, because most teenagers were sidekicks in superhero comics. There's a version where he says he came up with the name not because he saw a bug, but rather because of this pulp hero from the 1930s called the Spider, which had nothing to do thematically or really, gimmick wise with Peter Parker and Spider-Man, but just the name. So the point is, all these stories contradict, or at least are divergent enough that you have to take them with a grain of salt to a certain extent. But those were the stories that he told. He would say, and then the rest of the story for him would be, there was ins and outs of like Martin Goodman, the publisher, who was his cousin-in-law, would be skeptical about creating Spider-Man, and then Spider-Man would be this big hit. He'd tell the story. But it also involved handing the art off initially to Jack Kirby. And this is pretty universally agreed upon, that Kirby did a few pages of Amazing Fantasy 15 of the first Spider-Man story. And those pages have been, as far as anyone knows, lost. There are a few people that claim they've seen them, but he only made it a few pages in. It's unclear what happened next. It was either, Stan said that he looked at the art and thought, Jack's great, but this character looks too big and muscular, and I want him to be like spindly and more human looking. Jack said it was just, I was doing too much and we needed to pass it off to somebody else, and Ditko was really good, so we gave it to Ditko. But either way, it ended up with Steve Ditko, who then, as far as we can tell, came up with the costume and came up with a lot of the other characters, or at least was visually designed them, and then was doing the first pass on their stories, which is a big contribution. So those are kind of the divergent paths it suggests the divergent paths. You have that version that Stan says, and then you have the version, as you might assume, that Kirby has, in addition to all of what I just said, which is like how he came up with Spider-Man. And that then there's a controversial story about whether it's, he and Joe Simon came up with this predecessor character, the Fly, or whether it was, Jack Olick and CC Beck. Like the thing about comics history you have to understand is you never lack for irritatingly granular details. Like you never run out of things where you're like, okay, I want to just say this guy created this thing, but I can't, because if I'm going to be honest, there's like all of these caveats I have to make, and it gets very confusing very fast. I did my best to keep it clear in the book, but as you can tell, these creator, chains of title things get really, really weird really fast.
And to give our listeners a sense of just how much was going on at any given time in sort of the heyday of the Marvel era, the early 60s, you talk at one point about how many pages a year Jack Kirby was putting out. How much work was he doing in a given year?
Oh God, I can't, I'm really bad with numbers. So I don't want to misquote what I already wrote.
This is the test.
Jack was a machine. I mean, just anyone would agree with that. Stan said that all the time. Stan gave Jack a lot of props, even if he didn't give him proper credit. He would talk Jack up all the time, even when they were estranged. And Jack just created kind of a superhuman amount of pages, especially in like 62, 63. Fantastic Four #1 comes out in 61, then the Hulk, and then, and then you got Spider-Man and Ant-Man and the Avengers and everybody. Basically 61 to 63, 64, that stretch, there's just this incredible explosion of creativity. And so much of it is Jack or Stan and Jack. And after a while, a lot of those books get handed off to other writer artists, but like, X-Men #1 is Kirby, Avengers #1 is Kirby. You just go across a lot of the board and there's a lot there. And he made a lot of pages. He could work unbelievably quickly. He was not even classically trained, wasn't really trained at all. And I don't know how to describe it again without getting my numbers wrong, but just suffice it to say, way more than seems humanly possible was what he was putting out. Like you ask any artist and they will tell you, I have no idea how Jack Kirby did that.
Especially because he defined so much of the modern comic style at the same time. It wasn't just hack work, right? I mean, he was redefining the whole genre, the medium.
Right. I mean, the art isn't for everybody.
Sure.
There are a lot of people who, back then even were like, what is this garbage? But I mean, it's unusual. It didn't look like anything else that was really out there other than past Jack Kirby comics, but they were also a step forward from past Jack Kirby comics in that, for whatever reason, again, even if you want to say Stan created the characters as ideas, Stan couldn't draw. And you think back on the costuming across the board for those early characters, and not just costuming, but, visual conception. And that stuff has just enormous staying power. You're exactly right. Like he's in this stretch kind of redefining the way comics look and the way these characters that, you go see a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, you're not looking at a Jack Kirby artwork, but you're looking at, costumes that originated with that, overall sort of approach visually. Steve Ditko once said something, which was Stan was talking about being the creator of Spider-Man in an interview, and Ditko got very upset about it and made this little comic sort of screed thing. And he says, go to Marvel's offices. What's up on the wall? What's on the stationery? Is it the word Spider-Man, or is it Spider-Man's mask?
Right.
Or is is it the character, or is it the text of the story? And you can't underestimate that. Like just the other day, I was just walking down the street and saw somebody in a Spider-Man mask, and I was just like, this one visual symbol has had such enormous reach, and it's something that's sort of incontrovertibly the artists. But anyway, that's sort of a tangent.
One of the things that also jumps out at me, Abraham, is that Jack Kirby obviously co-created Captain America, created the Eternals,
Sure.
lots of other characters. Steve Ditko created the Question, he created the Creeper, he created other characters that all sort of live on to this day.
Right.
Stan Lee's creations, absent those folks and a couple other key writer artist types, don't really stand out. Does that weigh into trying to assess to the best of our ability who created these characters?
I know it's so tantalizing to just base it on that, because you're exactly right. You look at what Stan did outside of his work with his work at Marvel, and more importantly, for the question of creation, the characters he created when he wasn't working or co-created or had some relationship to the first issue of characters that were being created after Ditko and Kirby had left, because he kept being a co-writer on these comics until the early 70s. And there were some issues of those things. There are a lot of issues of those that are classics that people adore. But very often he was not actually generating new intellectual property into terms of characters. So then he leaves active duty writing at Marvel, and he has a hand in creating She-Hulk and Spider-Woman for kind of slightly crass consumerist reasons, but it's running a company. That's how things work. But then after that, it's like, the only creation anybody can really name is Stripperella, his ill-fated 2003 Spike TV cartoon starring Pamela Anderson about an exotic dancer who fights crime. And that's, people remember that as a joke, but like that's kind of the only other creation people can conjure up when you ask, what did Stan create outside of Marvel? Or what characters did he create outside of this very exclusive amount? So you want to think, okay, well, that proves, since especially Ditko and Kirby created so many things independent of Stan, that must mean Kirby most likely was the main progenitor of all of these characters. And I can see why you'd get sympathetic to that argument. But without getting into too much detail, although Jack went, to his dying day, claimed that he was the sole progenitor, he would tell stories about the creation of these characters that wouldn't totally make sense or would contradict themselves or would have holes in the narrative. And it's really hard to find, when I say it's really hard, I think it's impossible to get a conclusive answer about who created these characters. I don't think we're ever going to have a moment where we go, oh, here's this document that, makes it incontrovertibly clear that it was Stan or it was Jack or it was 50%, whatever. And living with that ambiguity is one of the challenges of knowing the story of Stan Lee. You can't escape this question, and yet you can't answer it at the same time. And that's enormously frustrating, but I don't know, maybe it's sort of a lesson of how you have to approach reality, because oftentimes the only honest answer is, I don't know. And there's a real temptation to go, well, because Stan said it was all him and Jack said it was all him, it was probably somewhere in the middle, which I've never found compelling as an argument. Maybe it was somewhere in the middle, But
Right.
it's not like you're doing mathematical averages here.
Yeah, that's like the both sidesism of the Marvel universe or something.
It's the both sidesism of the Marvel universe. Yes, exactly. That's what it is. You just go, well, this is probably a little bit of both because that's, an answer that makes me comfortable. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's any grounds to it. So anyway, it's hard to determine who the one honest man is.
So as Marc mentioned earlier, we just had this sort of en masse trailer released for the new MCU projects with the Stan Lee voiceover. And one thing you do mention in the book is that even though Stan Lee is so tightly connected to the MCU movies, one thing you talk about in the book is he didn't like the movies.
Yeah, I mean, two people, his former business associate / manager / hanger-on / interesting guy, Kia Morgan, told me, as did Stan's former bodyguard, Gavin Vanover, that Stan really didn't like superhero movies and had seen like 2 of them. And that they would go to the premieres, they'd go to the red carpet premieres, and Stan would walk the red carpet, get his picture taken, do autographs, meet people, whatever, do little Hollywood news hits. And then he would just say, let's get the hell out of here. Like, he would not stick around for the movie. And then later, he was going blind and deaf, so watching a movie wouldn't be that appealing anyway. But even when he could, it was just not his kind of thing. So it was weird seeing, I mean, of course it makes sense. It's not like I can't understand why Disney would choose to have old audio they just had kicking around of Stan and put that over overwrought trailer for trailers, but at the same time, it's kind of weird and ironic and, funny because Stan was not a fan of these movies. He was a fan of being in them. He loved doing the cameos and he loved doing the red carpets, but he was not, again, this is what I've heard. And there may be evidence to the contrary, but no one ever said, oh, this was Stan's favorite Marvel movie. Or like Stan kept talking about how much he loved this other Marvel movie. It never came up. And there's evidence to the contrary. But the character of Stan Lee loves the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies.
Sure. That's a really good way to put it.
And the character of Stan Lee lives on. I mean, the character of Stan Lee is doing that voiceover. And, my book hasn't, my book's been out for a few months now and it hasn't put a dent. I don't know, maybe it's put a dent or something, but it hasn't, I haven't shattered the myths of Stan Lee to a degree where, anybody in the broader general global public is necessarily going like, oh, Jacques Hughes at this Marvel Cinematic Universe trailer. People are just generally still excited about it because they love Uncle Stan. And, I'm not trying to write, a hatchet job to just take him down, but there is, you as a responsible biographer, part of your job is to say, okay, well, if I'm not doing PR for this person, what was their life like? And when it came to the movies, Stan, I've never seen any evidence that he was actually a big fan of these flicks.
Man, I would be fascinating if they'd had Slack back in 1961 to see those conversations and get some answers. Yeah. But since we don't have those, the book is just fantastic as like a way to ruminate, meditate, absorb all the evidence and information. But if a listener is themselves at a cocktail party, I think we will have those again in the future. I'm told that we will return to that universe. In theory, or a Zoom cocktail party, those things are definitely still the rage. If somebody in their group says, who created Spider-Man, what would you recommend they say?
We don't know. Some combination of, an and/or combination of Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee. And beyond that, and I'm not saying they all contributed equally and whatever. Spider-Man, it's pretty clear that Stan had a fair amount to do with that because everyone's recounting of Jack's initial pages for Spider-Man were that they were very different. The costume looked nothing like it. He had a gun. It was a web gun, but still, he was related to the police commissioner, it was a weird, not what we think of now. And then Ditko and Stan came to Ditko and was like, here, with an outline. Ditko didn't know who had created the outline, so that doesn't help us a ton. But, it could be that after Stan gave the pages back and said, I don't want to do this, he and Jack had a conversation about what the new version of Spider-Man would be like. We don't know. This is an extremely unsatisfying answer, and I hate to say it, but
I think that's totally reasonable. And that's, again, why, I think it part of what makes this a frustrating but really compelling story to dig into.
Yeah, I mean, it's the carrot that you can never quite reach on the stick in front of you. You just keep digging because you're expecting, at some point, there's got to be a conclusive answer for this. And there just isn't. And it stinks, but at the same time, that's how a lot of life is. And I feel like, I already said this a little bit, but if there's one thing I can try to convey with the book, I would hope it would be that you sort of have to live with a certain amount of ambiguity in your life, whether that's factual ambiguity, like what we're talking about here, or moral ambiguity, in that people really want to either hold Stan on a pedestal, or if you're one of the hardcore Jack Kirby truthers, you want to say he had no talent whatsoever and was an active detriment. And that's, I don't know. I was not trying to go to either of those extremes, and I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right.
So Abraham, clearly this book was a labor of love, and it seems like a lot of other emotions. And I know from just reading some initial reviews of this book and some feedback online, you've been on the receiving end of some vitriol for having written it.
Yeah, sure.
Especially given the timing close to his death. What I'd like to talk about is how writing this book affected you, both as a journalist and as a comics fan. There's actually a great picture in the book of you meeting Stan Lee at a signing.
Yeah, at a signing in I believe it was the summer of 1998 at the Wizard World Comics Convention in Rosemont, Illinois, where I lived in Oak Park, Illinois, and yeah, the one-on-one interaction we ever had was me getting a copy of Fantastic Four number 45 signed by 47, signed by him.
That was the one right before Galactus, right?
Yeah, it's the end. Well, it's the last full issue of the Inhuman saga. The next issue has the ending of that saga and the beginning of Galactus, because they hadn't figured out how to pace comics necessarily back then. Although I love it, but that is so not standard operating procedure anymore.
No, there was a lot of bleed over in the early days where you just sort of...
Well, I mean, the Galactus saga then ends midway through issue number 50, and the rest of issue number 50 is Johnny starts college. Which I actually, I was recently on the podcast, or no, sorry, I recorded the interview and it was just in text on a Substack. God, listen to the 21st century sentence I just said there. My friend Marc Slutsky, and we were the topic was we were going to get into deep on the Galactus saga. And what I realized in rereading it for the umpteenth time there was I actually love that it ends with Johnny going to college, because there's this moment in the comic where Johnny is going how can I go to college when I've seen beyond the stars? Because Johnny goes on that, cosmic journey around the end to get the ultimate nullifier. And it's he's sitting in college and just going this is bullshit compared to what I've been through. I love that.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah. It's this weird amount of pathos, because Johnny's a teenager. And he's just seen God tried to kill him, and then he had to go find a weapon that could kill God. And then it's okay, time to matriculate. Do you want to take expository writing this semester? Or, it's great. Anyway, I'm sorry. That was not the question you were asking. But.
No, that's great.
Just going on the digression again, then after issue 50 is issue 51, which is actually one of my favorite
This Man, This Monster.
Of all time. This Man, This Monster. Fantastic comic book. But it's if you didn't know that the first 50 issues happened, it's it's completely unaffected by anything that came before it.
I know. It's great. It's this total standalone. And then right after that, you have 52 and 53, which is the debut of Black Panther. It's this insane amount of creativity in this very brief period of time.
It's 6 better things than I'll ever do in my life.
Right. And it's just one after the other. And it's important. It's very important to remember, because a lot of people think I've written this book just to tear down Stan. You look at those comics, Stan's contributions are a huge part of that. Even if he was not the main creator of those characters, the dialogue is great. I mean, a lot of it feels stilted and archaic by modern terms, but for the time it was very cutting edge. And there, I use one of the lines from Fantastic Four number 49, the middle chapter of the Galactus saga, as the epigraph for part 1 of the book, of what use are brief nameless lives to Galactus. Like Stan's writing in like the dialogue and narration and the hype man material in the back were enormously exciting in that run. And you talk to anybody who was growing up in the 60s and getting really into Marvel, as I did, when usually like I'd be interviewing a comics creator like Kurt Busiek or something, and I'd say like, what, when did you get turned on to Stan? And if they were growing up in the 60s, I would ask them, okay, so what kept you coming back? And the answer so often was not the writing, it was not the art, it was the letters pages. It was, I could not get enough of that community, because it was practically a message board. I mean, in this very rough sense, where like you could write letters and they would get printed. And then you would see where those people were from and you'd look them up and you'd write the guy a letter and you'd say, do you want to copy my fanzine or whatever? Like this was primo real estate. And Stan was really good at engaging kids and teenagers, despite the fact that he's like a guy in his 40s by the time he's doing this stuff. Fantastic Four number 1 comes out when he's 38. He had this real rapport with young people and kept that rapport as they got older, all the way until the point where they're in college and he's doing these like college lecture tours, whatever. Anyway, sorry, I keep getting us off on different tangents here, but
this is absolutely fantastic.
This show is called Ponder Vision. We go in weird, wild places. Abraham.
You
do not have
great.
to apologize.
Right. This is not a straightforward
creative meandering. That's what we're here for.
Okay, good.
And I'm a lawyer. I'm used to depositions.
Oh,
so
good. I've been reading a lot of depositions for the Vince McMahon book, and fascinating. Like,
you're telling me that Vince McMahon's been involved in litigation?
I know. It's shocking to find out. And
wow.
Congressional, subcommittee hearings and but yes, reading a good deposition, the boring ones, I don't know how you get through all of them as a legal person, but the exciting legal depositions, it's so much better than any actual legal drama. Like when you get the people, like the really, really mean lawyers and like the people who are getting interviewed who are just like, frick this court, like, can I swear on this? I can't remember.
You can totally swear on this.
You can completely.
Okay, great. We're just like, fuck this. This is, this is not, this is bullshit. I don't recognize the authority. Like, it's great. You love stuff like that. But the boring ones, I that's why I can never be a lawyer. I can't just get through. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
I don't recall. Like, who has the time? But anyway, yes. Okay, go ahead.
Whereas when it's your job and you have all those yes answers, you're great because you're like, I'm going to write a brief that's going to bore everybody, but it's got a clean answer.
You give me the peek inside for how it works.
Yeah, you don't need like a Q rating for the most of the depositions. You're just looking for the answers. So
right. Just like, okay, yes, all right, great, I got it. Okay, fair enough.
Did you, Abraham, how much of this did you sort of have in your head about sort of Stan Lee and the complexities of this? Like, I guess I'm asking, what were some of the surprises or discoveries that hit you either hard or in a good way, like, were really pleasing? Like, what popped the most that you weren't expecting?
The thing that I kept coming back to as something that really interested me, even if I was sort of worried that the rest of the world might not find it as interesting, was Stan's genealogical background, his family, and the world they came from, which was something that had not really been explored in any detail. And, I dug in. I did research through available databases. I hired a genealogist as a, consultant to like use resources that she had that I didn't. Her name is Meryl Shoemaker from We Go Way Back. Genealogy. She's great if you want to work with her. But anyway, once I did a lot of research on just the places that his parents came from. His parents were both Romanian Jewish refugees. They left Eastern Romania, not together. They didn't know each other until they met in the United States in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. There was this period from like 1899 until about 1910 or so, where massive exodus of Jews out of Romania because there was this huge wave of specific anti-Semitism there. So I researched Eastern Romania. I researched the Romanian Jewish exodus, and what I found, well, and then on top of all that, I should say, I also talked to Stan's brother, Larry Lieber, who is still with us. I talked to Larry for like 5.5 hours or something, all told. We had like 1 4-hour interview and then an additional one that was like 1.5 hours. And he gave me a lot about the family and about Stan's upbringing and their parents. And what it amounted to was this picture that I found very compelling. I mean, I'm Jewish. I think a lot about my own family past. I think a lot about Jewish history, American Jewish history. So I found it very interesting to learn that, for example, Stan and Larry's father, Jack Lieber, who was born Janku Ern Lieber in Romania, was very passionate about being Jewish. And more importantly, very disappointed in his sons, especially Stan, for not being Jewish enough. This was a huge sticking point. Because Jack, although he was not Orthodox, his father had been Orthodox, his brother was Orthodox, and he had this still very traditional mindset and would go to synagogue, just not all the time. And more importantly, was just very proud and nationalistic about being a Jew. And, big supporter of the state of Israel and all this stuff. And Stan didn't want anything to do with any of that. Stan had no interest in or time for Jewishness, Jewish community, Judaism, Jewish identity, whatever. It could not have interested him less. He, in his almost 96 years on this earth and all the interviews he did, the only one I ever found was in like 2005. He said, Jewish people, and I include myself in this, think a certain way. And that was about it. Other than that, he wrote the introductions for books on comics about the Holocaust, or a book about the comics about the Holocaust and a book about Jews in the comics industry. In neither one does he mention being Jewish. Wow. He might as well have been anybody. Wow. It was so well. And you think that's interesting. The real thing was in his memoir, which came out in 2002. He's talking about how he and his wife, Joan, had tried to adopt at one point, and they couldn't because they were in a mixed marriage. Joan was an Episcopalian English woman. But the way Stan describes it is he says, we couldn't adopt because we were in a mixed marriage. Joan was Episcopalian and my parents were Jewish.
Wow.
I was Jewish. My parents were Jewish, which is a very deliberate choice of words. That's not like, why would you phrase it that way unless you were...
Especially for a writer. I mean, it's like,
yeah, he's a writer. He thinks about his words very carefully. And,
And he thinks about his self-image very carefully.
Right. And, well, that's the thing. I mean, he always said he didn't change his name for any reason other than he wanted it to be, a pen name. He didn't want to have his name associated with stuff that wasn't going to be the great American novel. Who knows how true that all is, but like he definitely did not get involved with the Jewish community, and his dad was horrified that Stan married out of the religion, out of the ethnicity, religion, whatever you want to call us, and then on top of that, his daughter, his sole surviving child, J.C. Lee, was baptized. And Larry Lieber told me that, like, telling Jack Lieber, their dad, that his grandchild was baptized, his only grandchild, was amounted to cruelty. Like, it was just Jack was so devastated by it. Now, none of this, I should say, is me saying, you're a bad person if you abandon Jewishness. I'm definitely not saying that. Whatever you want to do is sei gesund.
Right.
But it's just interesting that this story had not really been explored. And I think it was very telling. It gives you a lot of a sense of the things Stan wanted to escape and the things he wanted to be. So to answer your question, yeah, that really stuck out for me. I remember when I was interviewing Larry and him telling me that Jack used to write them letters saying, you got to observe the holidays, you got to be more Jewish. I remember just sitting there going, what a fascinating, weird little detail. Like writing letters to your son. He was living alone. He was a widower. His wife, their mom, Celia died in 1947. He lived until 1968. So he has almost 20 years where he's just living alone in this apartment.
Wow.
Writing angry letters to his sons and doing whatever else, I don't know.
And all living in the same city, right? I mean, they're all...
Yeah, they're living in the same, but they didn't really have much of a relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, they had some of a relationship, but like Stan, by his own admission, he, later in life would say, my father didn't think much of me. He really was not satisfied with anything I did, even when I was doing pretty well for myself. So it was a strained relationship, and it's a strained relationship with Larry. He and Larry were not close. They were, insofar as they were in contact a lot, because Larry for decades was drawing the Spider-Man newspaper strip. So he had to be in touch with Stan, even though Stan wasn't writing it anymore at that point. For a lot of that, he was being ghostwritten by Roy Thomas. Stan would still be the one who made the phone call to Larry and say like, okay, here's what I want to change or whatever. But that was like kind of it. And Larry worked for his brother at multiple times in the course of their careers, but like they had no real emotional relationship. And Stan and Joan really according to Larry, really made that clear. Like, according to Larry, Stan once he would come to New York and not tell Larry, despite the fact that Larry lived in New York. Stan lived in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills. He was in Los Angeles. So he would fly to New York and just not tell his own brother. He would, Larry told a story about Stan doing an appearance at New York Comic Con, not telling him he was coming to town, and Larry watching on the live stream from home.
Oh, man.
Seeing his brother do this thing.
Yeah.
It was not a close, warm relationship. And I don't know. I found that very interesting. Maybe that, not to sound too crass, but just when you're looking at a family dynamic like that, it's hard not to feel like there's rich thematic material there,
One of the things about the comic book industry and the creators that we're talking about is we're often talking about these iconic characters, Spider-Man, Thor, the Hulk, all of these characters. But would you say that Stan Lee, the character, is Stan Lee's greatest creation?
I would say something. It's certainly the most. Stan Lee, the character, is the only thing Stan can take sole credit for pretty comfortably. And he was masterful at creating that character. And I don't think it's my place to say what the greatest was, but certainly the most useful one for him was the character of Stan Lee, because he stopped. Even his defenders will not say he was creating big successful characters after the 60s and a little bit in the 70s, but that character of Stan Lee remained extremely important, even as these characters were kind of flying off in directions that had nothing to do with him, and were multiplying and he wasn't creating them. The character of Stan Lee, the course was stayed, there were times when he was more popular than other times, but he was able to weather the fact that he was not a creative powerhouse after that period, if he was even a creative powerhouse in that period. I mean, he certainly was in terms of whatever. Outside of that, the big character was Stan Lee. And that character was in the movies. I mean, that's the thing. It wasn't just in the movies. The character was in the comics. I mean, you go back to early issues of the Fantastic Four, and they're already having cameo appearances from Stan and Jack. Like, Stan Lee has been a character in the Marvel universe for a very long time, in one form or another, and in multiple mediums. And that character isn't going anywhere. So I would argue that at the very least, the most useful and perhaps, I don't know about enduring, but in his own lifetime, sort of hardest to screw up was the character of Stan Lee. I mean, no matter what kinds of controversies might be discussed about about Stan Lee the man in comic circles or wherever, he was Teflon. I mean, none of it really affected the character of Stan Lee. The story about, being true to yourself and working hard and being, a hero and, all those good things, that stuff just never stopped. And to this day, even though you have like all the controversies around the end of his life, where there was all this awful elder abuse and scandal stuff happening, even with my book out, you still have that trailer that we were talking about. And you look on Twitter and like, I don't know, I tweeted sort of some like points about Stan's actual relationship with the movies. And like, I got some retweets and some likes, but like most people are still like, oh, well, the character of Stan Lee, I love him and he loves me. And that's something I want to be a part of. I mean, people would last tangent, and then I'll let you ask something. But right before the book was even out, people would get mad at me on the official Facebook page or on Twitter or whatever, just based on the subheading of the title of the book, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. Now, that doesn't imply necessarily that Stan did anything wrong, that he was responsible for his fall, but it's called Rise and Fall. And people would say, fall? He never fell. Like, how dare you?
Oh, my.
And here's the thing. Even if you accept the premise that Stan did nothing wrong in his life, you still have to reckon with the fact that, like, very publicly, he had a huge fall. Like his last year and a half was a tabloid nightmare.
Yeah.
With, like I said, with elder abuse, theft, grift, all kinds of stuff. That's patently a fall. But people were offended that I would even suggest that bad things happened to Stan Lee, because it's not so much about whether Stan Lee is a good or a bad person as much as it is the story of Stan Lee makes you feel good. And you don't want to hear a story about Stan Lee that makes you feel bad, because that feels like a contradiction in terms. And I get that. People have very intense relationships with Stan Lee, and I respect that. I mean, and it's not the worst thing in the world to have, a model that you want to live up to that is, all about fairness and kindness and, et cetera, et cetera. But that was a character. That there were overlaps, there were traits he had that also the character had, but like the character where nothing bad happened to him, and the story was just, maybe the worst thing that happened was he felt kind of underappreciated in the 1950s. And then everything happened in the 1960s, and then he rode off into the sunset. I mean, it just wasn't like that. We haven't even talked about the last third of his life, practically in this conversation, but it got really rough.
Mm-hmm. Jesse, you got any final questions for us here?
So, as we know, one of the greatest comic book character battles theorized in history is Darkseid versus Thanos.
Sure.
My question is, if you were just very, very high, which character would you create?
Which character between Thanos and Darkseid?
Darkseid would you create?
Ooh, probably Darkseid, just because Darkseid is such a manifestation of like every shitty depressive thought you ever have.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So
like it's true. Like, I mean, I couldn't create Darkseid. It's certainly visually, I could never come up with anything that looks as good as Darkseid does, or evil as the case may be. But I would guess my mind would go more in that direction. I have interviewed Jim Starlin on multiple occasions, the creator of Thanos. And, his motivation allegedly for creating Thanos was he was like hitting on a girl who was in a class on like Eros and Thanatos, the Freudian concepts of the, sex and the death drive. And he like went to the class and then, doodled a little character who actually looked, well, whatever. Now I'm going to get into too much detail, but I think Darkseid would be my answer. Yes.
Because I was thinking about this question, and I don't know, in a lot of ways, Thanos feels more like an id, like he's more like something you create on as when you were on an upper, when you were excited or your mind was just expanding.
Totally. But when you're, I mean, I don't know, when I get stoned, sometimes I'm rolling the dice, and one of the, you can end up in one of those holes where you're just like, life means nothing. I see past the veil of bullshit and there's nothing behind it. And that's the kind of thing that, that's the AntiLife Equation right there. That's like what, like Darkseid wants you to think about.
Yeah, I feel like there has to be a Darkseid t-shirt with that on it somewhere. That's pretty perfect.
God, some of the early Darkseid dialogue is just the best. I'm sorry, that's a whole thing we could talk about, but
no, I love it because there's so many absurd both Darkseid and Thanos moments, but I love the recurrent pastiche of Darkseid sitting in chairs.
Yes. Well, because it's terrifying. You just walk into your apartment and there's, Darkseid of all people just sitting on your couch saying, "Hey, how are you? Come on in." Like it's a very alarming sight. Or like going to Happy Land, the kids park. That's a great issue. Anyway, I could talk about Darkseid all day, but the Stan very much had nothing to do with Darkseid.
Indeed. That's very true. Abraham, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Oh, we had a good time.
fantastic.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Great. I enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, this is what Panther Vision's all about. Wild turns and surprises and fun conversations.
I've talked about this book so much that all I can do is go on tangents. I don't even remember what my shtick is anymore. So this was great. Thank you so much, everybody.
So where can people find and follow you and your work in case they want to keep track of these tangents?
Yeah, go to my website, which is abrahamriesman.com. That's Riesman. But if you misspell the IE, I have the other spelling registered and it redirects to the main one. Or you can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/AbrahamJoseph. Those are pretty much your repositories for all the Abe Riesman needs you might have.
True Believer by Abraham Riesman is available anywhere you buy books, and I can confirm the audiobook is really well done too. So, Jesse, this was great. Where can people find and follow you?
People can also find me on twitter.com at Jesse L. Taylor, all one word.
And I'm, of course, at Marc Faletti, Marc with a C, MarcFaletti. All right, legendary listeners, that is our show for today. I can't say that I will be ditching my ample alliterations anytime soon, but I will say that I will not think of them quite the same way ever again. We have some exciting interviews lined up for you between now and our preview for Loki in early June. And speaking of, they moved Loki to Wednesdays, so our lineup is going to be shuffling around. We'll figure out our new schedule and announce that once we get closer. In the meantime, help us combat the accursed algorithms that capitalism has foisted upon us by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or simply telling a friend about our show. Every listener means the world to us. Until next time, keep asking tough questions and grab a copy of True Believer.